Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years, Harris Ranch Resort, providing Western hospitality and award-winning cuisine, The Wonderful Company, committed to growing a better world, Comcast, connecting people to the moments and experiences that matter most, Producers Dairy, nourishing one life at a time, and Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Cook Land Company and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute and host of the Maddy Report. Today we'll be looking at the California state budget and pulling back the curtain on some of the politics and processes that shape the budget. Californians care about how their money is spent, but a lot of us don't really know how the state uses our tax dollars. Chris Hoene is the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center, and he's here to help demystify California's state budget. Chris, thanks for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be with you. So to start, could you just share a little bit about what your role entails and what does the California Policy and Budget Center do?
Yeah, we are a nonprofit budget and policy center that seeks to improve outcomes for Californians through better fiscal and budget policy. So we're not of government, we're outside of government, sort of like a watchdog organization, but we also try to explain the budget and help people access the debate so that they can participate and understand the decisions that are being made.
Obviously, we know that money matters in politics and in government, but why is California's state budget so important?
You know, it's important because we're a huge state, and the biggest policy decision that state leaders make every year is where we put the billions and billions of dollars that the state has to allocate and that come from taxpayer proceeds. So, you know, the state has over $300 billion that it allocates in various ways. The sort of main checking account, what we call the general fund, is over $200 billion. And so there's no more significant decision that state leaders are going to make than how those funds are spent.
And, I guess kind of, as we talk about that process and what it looks like, the state constitution establishes the rules of the budget process, and the governor and legislators craft the state's annual spending plan according to those rules outlined in the Constitution. What does the budget timeline look like, just to share a little bit with our listeners, according to the state constitution?
Right. So the Constitution says that on or before January 10th, the governor of California has to submit a spending plan to the state legislature. So the governor gets the first bite at the apple here. The legislature then deliberates, comes up with their own version of the budget over a period of months. State statute actually then says the governor has to submit a revised spending plan, something we call the May revision, by May 14th. The legislature then gets a chance to deliberate again, and the Constitution says they have to pass their version of the budget by midnight on June 15th, or they forego their own pay and per diem for every day that they are late. So they usually get the budget done on time. And then the governor has until late June to sign or veto the budget in time for us to start a new fiscal year on July 1st of each year.
And so there's really, it seems like a back and forth between the governor and the legislature, with the governor, as you mentioned, starting, and then the legislature sort of negotiating up until that deadline. Is that sort of correct?
The legislature gets lots of opportunity to deliberate about that. In the middle, we as the general public have an opportunity to weigh in all through that process. But ultimately, the governor sort of starts and stops the process. And that means a lot of the emphasis lies on what the governor's preferences might be for the budget.
And so I guess speaking of process, another unique feature of California's democratic process is the ballot initiative process, which has allowed citizens to have a say in the process of amending the Constitution. And also with regard to the budget, What are some of the key propositions that shape the way the state budget works?
Yeah, one of the unique things about California is that through the ballot measure process, we revise the budget process and some of the rules of the game fairly regularly. The biggest changes happened back in the early 2010s when there were a couple of ballot measures that changed the budget process. One of those actually reduced the threshold that it takes in the legislature to pass a budget, which had been 2/3 and was very difficult to get and often resulted in budgets being very late going into July, August, and September, to a simple majority, so 50% plus one, and the legislature's been able to enact budgets more easily since then. As a trade-off to that, back at that same time, another ballot measure was passed by voters that actually says the legislature still needs a 2/3 vote to raise taxes in California. So that means the legislature can now enact a budget with just a simple majority, but they have a much higher threshold they have to meet if they want to raise taxes on Californians.
Up next, we'll talk about some of the politics that surround the budget process. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We're talking with Chris Hoene, Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center, about the state budget process. And we want to dive a little bit into some of the politics that surround the budget. And obviously, this is something that your center tracks closely. And so we talked a little bit about this in the previous segment, but the governor has a lead role in the budget process, while the legislature is in charge of reviewing and revising the governor's proposals. Let's break down their duties. So first, what's the governor's main responsibility when it comes to the California state budget?
Yeah, the governor's job is to present spending plans at various phases that the legislature then gets to continue. But ultimately, the decision about how to appropriate money still lies with the legislature, and they have to authorize the governor to do so by enacting their own budget. And then there's lots of negotiations back and forth. The governor ultimately having the chance to veto things. He has the power of the line item veto, which means at the very end of the process, if there's something he doesn't like, he can wholesale eliminate an allocation or a program, or he can make reductions. He can't increase or create a new program on his own, but he ultimately can shape the final budget that he signs into law before July 1st.
What's the legislature's role in the budget process? And certainly there are a lot of California legislators. So how does that influence or affect the process?
Yeah, the legislature's key role is to, in some ways, really democratize the process. So the legislature has a whole set of committees that are budget committees, and then they have a committee at the top of that that's the sort of wholesale budget committee that oversees everything. And through those committees, they actually deliberate on the governor's proposals, their own alternative proposals. There are lots of hearings in Sacramento. After the pandemic, those hearings have increasingly been available virtually, so the general public, advocacy organizations, civic leaders can all participate in that process. And so the whole idea of the legislature's process is to make sure that there is some open deliberation about the options that are on the table that can then inform ultimately what the governor and the legislative leaders are going to go into a room together and decide in the last few weeks in May and June. So the legislature's process from January to June is very much more of an open process where the public can be a part of the deliberations.
There are also a lot of different pots of money, I think, that we hear when we talk about the budget process. We hear that referenced often, that make up California's state budget. What are the different pots of money? Could you kind of briefly break these down into the different types of funding sources that exist?
Yeah, there are different ways to think about this, but if you just think about one way to think about the pots of funding is that there's a pot of funding that the state creates through its own tax revenues. So there's the state generated revenue. And then there's federal revenues, which make up about 1/3 of the total that come in for a whole host of various programs that are for safety net services or infrastructure support or climate change. So there are also all these federal funds that come in, a lot of them by formula and with stipulations. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is then how the state allocates that. And the big pot of funding is the the state general fund, which you might think of as the overall checking account. That's where we tend to have most of the debate and deliberation. That's over $200 billion of the total budget. But there are hundreds of small special funds that are funds that have specific revenue sources, and the funding can only go to dedicated services. So for instance, you go to a state park and you pay the fee to enter the state park. Those revenues only go into a fund for state parks. It can't be used for general purposes. And so there are lots of those kinds of funds as well.
And certainly part of that, I know that local governments are very reliant on California's budget. And in the California Budget and Policy Center's report on the state budget process, it states that the budget is a local budget. What does that mean? And how does that translate to local governments?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people hear the word state budget, they probably think about the state capitol, deliberations happening in Sacramento, the politics, state agencies that are receiving a lot of the funding. But if you actually look at how the funding is allocated, the vast majority of the state budget is dedicated to local purposes. It's going into cash assistance. It's going out to people through tax credits and tax breaks. It's funding for things like K through 12 schools, funding for local governments, funding for universities, Cal State system, community colleges. So the vast majority of what the state funds finds its way into local communities and into people's pockets in various sorts of ways. So even though it's a state budget, it has very localized impacts and implications.
Chris Hoene with the California Budget and Policy Center, thank you for joining the Maddy Report today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we'll talk with Alexei Koseff, Capital Reporter for Calmatters, about this year's state budget process. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. There's been a lot of talk lately about California's state budget. For a few years, the state was touting one of the healthiest budget surpluses in the country. Now, in 2024, California faces a significant budget deficit. Alexei Koseff is a Capital Reporter for Calmatters, and he's been covering the state budget process over the last few months. Alexei, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So starting back in May, and you've been covering this for quite some time, but you wrote an article about Governor Newsom's plan to fix the California budget deficit. And at that time, obviously now it's been passed, it consisted of a combination of spending cuts and using reserves to balance the budget. Could you just give us a little more detail about what that initial plan entailed, and then how did it change over time?
Well, this is a position that the state has known that it's going to be in since last fall. The budget revenue has been coming in below expectations for months and months and months, and we've gotten to a position now where the deficit next year is projected to be more than $40 billion, with other continuing deficits in the years beyond that. So basically, the governor and legislators have been forced to sort of put the state in a position to respond to what's going to be a tough budget position for a while to come. And they're trying to look at how they can do that without devastating public programs that are so important to so many Californians. And there are definitely cuts that have been proposed, but they're trying to protect the social safety net programs such as healthcare and welfare that are, really, really crucial to a lot of the neediest Californians, while also, being responsible about not dipping too much into the reserve accounts that we have, and not relying too much on borrowing and other kinds of budget gimmicks that might be used to close that deficit. So it's a really delicate balance to get us to where we need to be.
And talking a little bit about that, you touched on how the legislature and the governor are trying to protect some of these programs. When the LAO first predicted a budget deficit, where did the legislature start, and what were some of those major changes that took place throughout the discussion over the last several months?
I'd say the biggest difference between the legislature and the governor, that where they had to sort of bridge the gap in this process, is that the legislature in general tends to want to protect a lot more different programs. You've got a Democratic caucus that is in control in the legislature, and they represent a much broader array of viewpoints and different constituencies than just the governor, who's sort of putting forward his proposal and speaking just for himself. And so he's got a certain vision, and then the legislature is trying to balance all these other different priorities and come up with its own approach forward. They were much more likely to want to, protect some of these climate, housing, education funding, things that, the governor had proposed to cut, and try and find other ways to balance the budget without, devastating the funding for those programs as much. So it was months and months of negotiations back and forth to try and get us to this point where we are now, where we do have an agreement that was recently passed.
And talking about those negotiations, obviously when it comes to the budget, there are a lot of numbers involved, but I think a big question that may be on a lot of our viewers' minds is, would you say that data or politics drives California's budgetary discussions more?
And that's a really great question. And I think it is obviously a little bit of both, as it always is in politics. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't escape the data, which is, basically the estimates of the massive deficit that we're looking at, which again is in the tens of billions of dollars. And just to put that into context, California has about a $300 billion budget that includes both the general fund revenue and all kinds of special funds, federal funding, and stuff like that. So to have a deficit that could be more than $40 billion next year is a huge number. At the same time, the choices that California officials are making about how to respond to that reality, that's political, because those choices reflect the priorities of what are the programs we need to protect, where are the places that we believe, can afford to take a loss, and, who is basically going to suffer or be protected in, what interests, what people in this process. So all of those are difficult political choices that have to be made.
And talking about next year's budget, I also kind of want to dive into the numbers a little bit, looking at previous budgets. So how does this year's approved budget for the upcoming fiscal year compared to last year's spending or even previous fiscal years for the state of California?
Yeah, well, I would just note that sort of at the top line, it has shrunk slightly. We still have a massive budget, as I mentioned, about $300 billion, but it's shrunk from the highs of the last few years by about 10%.
This is the Maddy Report. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We're talking with Alexei, Capital Reporter for Calmatters, about this year's state budget process. So the governor and legislature made some major cuts, as you had just mentioned in the previous segment, and has delayed certain actions to reduce the deficit. Can you just elaborate a little bit more specifically for our viewers? What were some of the major maybe wins in the state budget and also major losses?
I think it's hard sometimes to talk about wins and losses because that's really going to, depend on, the people who are going to be affected by those changes. But, I think some of the interesting choices perhaps that were made include, there was a lot of pressure from liberal lawmakers to cut more from prison spending in order to protect other programs. And they convinced the governor to agree to cuts of hundreds of millions of dollars more per year to the prison budget in order to protect, spending on things like healthcare and welfare. I would also note there's going to be really big cuts to state government spending. Every department is now going to face about a 7.25% hit to its budget, just across the board. And also the state is expecting to save billions of dollars per year by not filling thousands of vacant positions. So that could really change just how the state government operates and the services that it provides. As I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of cuts to affordable housing and climate programs. So, advocates in those spaces are definitely feeling like they've taken some losses. But, in return, there are, some scholarship programs for college students that are going to be that we're set to receive very large cuts in the governor's budget proposal, and the legislature fought to reduce those and preserve a lot of that money.
And, are there, and so you talk about those, last details. And so, is that going to be done in, I guess, this August time period, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, most of the agreement has been worked out, and sometimes it's really just about, coming to an agreement about how to carry out those decisions. And so, there isn't necessarily anything major, but, it's a process of implementing this budget now. The real change to look forward to is if, the fiscal conditions of the state change considerably in the months ahead, either get much worse or much better. Then everyone may feel compelled to come back to the negotiating table in the fall or next year, and they may be forced to make further cuts, or if there's more money than expected, then they may want to, go back and perhaps give more funding to certain programs that, were facing cuts.
And so going forward, what can the legislature do, or what do you think, what steps are going to be taken to try to proactively reduce the deficit, or do you think that they'll kind of address it on a case-by-case basis?
So they are actually proposing, in the months ahead to put, pass some laws in order to try and increase the size of the reserves that California has, and also actually to come up with a plan in the future to set aside more money from the surpluses and, not spend it until it actually comes into the state's coffers. So, kind of create a little account to say, this is money that we want to work with, here's how we want to spend it, but we won't spend it until future years when that money actually materializes. And so, these are parts of plans of basically, ideas that Newsom and the legislative leaders are trying to come up with in order to have like a smarter approach about a more stable and fiscally sound policy for the state budget.
Alexei, Koseff with Calmatters, thank you for joining the show today. We really appreciate it.
Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit maddyinstitute.com. We'll see you next week. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.